Meet Thomas F. O'Neill, a young private in the 7th Cavalry Regiment, who found himself in the midst of one of the most infamous battles in American history, Custer's Last Stand. Under the command of Major Marcus Reno, O'Neill rode into the fray on that fateful day, June 25, 1876, as the Native American tribes clashed with the U.S. Army in a battle that would become a legendary tale of bravery, sacrifice, and survival. Get ready to experience the thrill of the Battle of Little Bighorn through the eyes of a soldier who lived to tell the tale. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. We marched until the evening of June 23rd, when we encamped for the night. The following day, we commenced our march at 4 a.m., proceeding up the Rosebud, and encamped late that evening. About 10 o'clock that night, we received orders to saddle up and undertake a night march. We continued on the trail until 4 a.m., when we halted to brew coffee, resuming our march about 6 o'clock. After several hours, we arrived at the head of the Rosebud. Thence, we began to traverse the divide between the Rosebud and Little Bighorn rivers. Shortly thereafter, the command came to a halt. The call for officers was sounded, and all officers reported to General Custer for instructions. This brief conference concluded, we were soon again in the saddle. Our scouts were actively engaged in reconnaissance, reporting fresh signs of Indians in front of and on the flanks of our column. We were now following an Indian trail, nearly a quarter of a mile in width in some places, indicating that large bodies of savages had recently passed in the direction we were headed. When we were approximately 10 miles distant from the Little Bighorn River and the Indian encampment, Captain Benteen was ordered to the left and front of our column with 3 companies of cavalry. He was instructed to reconnoiter and rejoin the command if he encountered no Indians after proceeding a prudent distance. In fact, he espied no signs of Indians until his return within sight of the river, just as Reno's men had completed their charge through to the opposite bank of the stream. Within 3 miles or so of the river, we chanced upon a spot where a small band of Indians had encamped. Evidently, we surprised them, as they retreated to the larger camp on the river, leaving their cooking utensils on the fires and 1 tepee standing. From this point, we took to the gallop, finally arriving at a lofty bank overlooking the river. Down the river, on the opposite bank, and about a mile distant from us, we espied the Indian camp at the edge of a narrow strip of timber or brush, where small cottonwood trees grew. At this point, the stream ran close to the high banks. The Indian village was partially concealed from us by a bend in the river. The Indians, however, appeared at the edge of the camp in great numbers, mounted and running about, seemingly in a state of great agitation. It was at this juncture that General Custer ordered Major Reno to take his battalion of 3 troops to the opposite side of the stream and attack the camp, saying, "I will support you." I was part of Major Reno's battalion, and we were marched down an old dry creek bed that debouched into the river nearby. Here, we crossed the Little Bighorn, the water reaching the horses' bellies. On the opposite bank, we formed in 4s and took up the gallop toward the Indians. When within approximately 700 yards of them, we formed into line of battle across the river bottom. When within about 500 yards of the Indians, they opened fire upon us. As the Indians emerged in great numbers to oppose us, and it became apparent that our force of approximately 130 or 140 men could not possibly charge through such a superior force, our officers decided to adopt a defensive strategy. Orders were given to dismount and prepare to fight on foot. 3 troopers out of every 4 men dismounted, while the 4th man held the horses. A line was formed, and the horses were maneuvered to remain with the line, 6 or 7 yards to its rear. We now commenced returning fire upon the Indians, whose main body appeared to be approximately 1,000 yards distant, although considerable numbers circled about within 500 yards or less, all mounted and firing upon us. Our right flank rested near the brush, our left extending about 200 yards across the plain, with men spaced 3 yards apart along the line. At this juncture, Custer's command was situated on the opposite bank of the river, and the distance between the 2 columns grew greater as we advanced. When the engagement commenced, I estimate that Custer and Reno were approximately 1.5 miles apart. General Custer and his 5 companies now vanished behind a lofty bluff, proceeding in the direction of the lower end of the Indian village, and that was the last we ever saw of him or his command alive. From our current position, we could behold the extent of the village, which appeared to be over 2 miles in length, with tepees densely covering the river bottom and the camp spanning 700 or 800 yards in width in some areas. Shortly, the Indians began to close in on our left flank, which was not as well protected. Major Reno evidently realized the peril of being surrounded or flanked and wheeled the line, our backs facing the river and our right flank oriented toward the village. It was discovered that the stream had previously flowed closer to our rear position but had since changed course, leaving a deep ditch approximately 300 yards behind us. We were ordered to lie down on the edge of this bank, maintaining a constant fire, while our horses were led behind us. 20 men, including myself, under Lieutenant McIntosh's command, were ordered to deploy in skirmish line and scout the brush to determine if the Indians could attack us from the rear. We found dense underbrush, vines, and cottonwood trees growing in this area, as well as a deep cut or washout at its head, near the village. As we failed to discover any Indians between us and the river, the lieutenant returned and reported accordingly. At this juncture, the fighting was fiercely intense, with the Indians charging up to our position with great audacity. They would discharge their weapons, wheel their ponies about, and hastily retreat to reload. However, we observed that they were massing in greater numbers on our left flank, whence they could deliver a flanking fire. Our officers surmised that they were preparing to charge our left flank. A brief consultation ensued among the officers, who shouted instructions to one another from their positions along the line. It was decided that we should retreat to a more defensible position, as we were suffering significant casualties among our men and horses. Major Reno accordingly gave the order to "Get to your horses, men." As this order was being executed, the fire from our troopers diminished significantly. Indeed, it nearly ceased altogether. This emboldened the Indians, who pressed in upon us with renewed vigor and in increasing numbers. Their forces were reinforced by hundreds of additional warriors arriving from the lower end of the village every minute. Upon reaching our horses, the command to mount was given. We were to charge across the river. Each man drew his pistol, loaded his carbine, and held it at the ready in front of him on the saddle or suspended from his sling belt. The troopers emerged from the thicket in pairs, those on the right flank prepared to deliver fire in that direction, while those on the left flank attended to the opposite side. It was approximately 3/4 of a mile across a perfectly level plain before we could reach a suitable fording point. Beyond that lay a remarkably steep bank to ascend in order to reach the bluffs, during which the troops would be fully exposed to a merciless fire. Every man in our small command seemed to fully comprehend the dire circumstances in which we found ourselves, and what was expected of him, namely, to maintain a constant fire and ensure that every shot counted. As we emerged from the thicket, a thunderous war whoop burst forth from 1,000 throats. It was a race for life. The Indians pressed in closely on either side of our column, firing upon our troopers, who in turn returned their fire. It was a hand-to-hand conflict, with both Indians and troopers striving to pull each other from their horses, often succeeding after exhausting their ammunition. I witnessed 6 or 7 of our men falling from their horses, struck by bullets. One poor fellow nearby was shot in the body and, as he fell to the ground, received a second shot through the head. I distinctly heard the shots as they struck him. I now found myself in the most desperate situation I had ever faced in my life. Our men were falling, Indians were tumbling from their ponies, either killed or wounded. Riderless horses and ponies were dashing about, and the air was filled with the roar of rifles, carbines, and revolvers. The cheers of our troopers and the war whoops of the Indians created a perfect pandemonium. Before I had ridden 200 yards, my horse collapsed beneath me, felled by an Indian bullet. I was left dismounted amidst the Indians, watching as my comrades distanced themselves from me. I expected to feel the impact of a bullet, arrow, or spear in my body at any moment. For a moment, I was paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. My initial thought was to run after the command, but the folly of such a course soon became apparent. I then determined to attempt to reach the thicket from which we had just emerged. So, I turned around and made a dash for it, expecting each moment to be my last on earth. However, the Indians seemed intent on pursuing the mounted men, and many of them passed me by without appearing to notice me. Others pointed their guns at me as they rode past at full speed. Some fired at me but missed. I pointed my carbine at those who came close, and although I am certain I must have wounded some, whose ponies carried them safely on, I saw only one fall. As I reached the thicket and dashed into concealment, I came face to face with Lieutenant DeRudio. Like myself, his horse had been shot from under him, and he had experienced a similar ordeal in reaching the thicket. The lieutenant was gazing intently at the retreating column, doubtless wishing, like myself, that he was with it. I was overjoyed to see him, even under such perilous conditions. Prior to that moment, I thought I was the only unfortunate left behind. The lieutenant then informed me that 2 others, like ourselves, had been left behind and were mere yards away. It transpired that the 2 men were Billy Jackson, one of our half-breed scouts, and Fred Gerard, an interpreter. Lieutenant DeRudio gathered us together and provided us with hasty instructions on what to do in the event of an Indian rush, which we anticipated at any moment, as our concealment seemed unlikely to last. We lay in a depression or ancient riverbed, surrounded by thick underbrush that effectively hid us from the Indians' view. They rode back and forth on the plain before us, mere feet away, their excitement palpable. They reminded me of a disturbed ant's nest, each one intent on their own purpose. The lieutenant ordered us not to fire until discovered, and we braced ourselves for the inevitable. We lay on our stomachs, our heads level with the top of the hole, vigilantly scanning our surroundings in different directions, prepared to fire simultaneously upon any approaching Indians. Lieutenant DeRudio kept watch in all directions, his eyes keen and encouraging. "Men," he said, "we must face death someday, and we shall meet it like brave men. Yet, I hold hope that we shall escape this predicament." It wasn't long before several squaws approached our position, gathering their own dead and wounded. Their lamentations were pitiful, wailing and crying as they tended to their fallen. They stripped the bodies of our men, subjecting them to gruesome mutilations with their knives. We witnessed some of these atrocities, which left me feeling faint and sickened. The thought of suffering a similar fate loomed over me, and I resolved to fight valiantly if discovered. Our advantageous position led us to believe we could take down several attackers before succumbing. I couldn't gauge Lieutenant DeRudio's hopes, but mine had vanished. I never expected to escape alive. My life flashed before me, transporting me back to my childhood home in the East and forgotten friends. Memories flooded my mind, momentarily distracting me from the peril surrounding us. Hours passed, 1, 2, 3, without any attempt to capture us or discovery. We remained concealed until darkness fell over the plain. After a whispered conference, we decided to seek out the command, if any remnants survived, which we doubted. "Indians never fight at night," the lieutenant whispered, "and if we stick together and follow my orders, I believe we'll reach the command alive." We were unaware of Custer's or Reno's fate. The intense firing we had heard both up and down the river suggested heavy losses. Personally, I believe that the cessation of firing in Custer's direction around 5 o'clock indicated his retreat to Reno's position. Major Reno's command continued to exchange fire at intervals, suggesting they were under attack. However, their firing also ceased around dark. We spoke in hushed tones, wary of being overheard by the Indians. Now, we decided to abandon our hiding place, a perilous move even in the darkness. We cautiously surveyed our surroundings, listening intently, but detected nothing. The moon was up, shining through a haze, but its light was dim. We resolved to make a desperate bid for our lives, come what may, as it was our only hope. Remaining in our current position until dawn was too risky. We had gone without food or drink all day, and the scorching heat had left our throats parched. I was perhaps more thirsty than the others, having suffered a fall on the skirmish line, which caused my nose to bleed profusely. With no chance to tend to it, the blood had run down my throat, almost choking me. My thirst seemed unbearable, and I feared succumbing to it before reaching water. As we emerged from the thicket, Gerard and Jackson were mounted on ponies they had hidden in the brush, while the lieutenant and I proceeded on foot. We advanced only a short distance before encountering a ghastly sight. We found ourselves on the ground where our command had clashed with the Indians in their retreat. The savages had overrun them, killing several men, who lay stripped and mutilated by the squaws' knives. We didn't linger, as all the men were beyond our aid. We followed the trail, marked by the dead bodies of troopers and horses in the faint light. As we approached the river, we encountered a group of mounted Indians, 8 or 10 in number, about 100 yards away. The lieutenant and I attempted to conceal ourselves behind the ponies ridden by Gerard and Jackson, hoping to blend in with the Indians. However, they seemed suspicious and fled in the opposite direction, much to our relief. Quickening our pace, we soon reached the river at the point where the command had hastily crossed during their chaotic retreat. We scanned the opposite bank for any sign of where they had ascended the steep bluff, but saw only a dark, towering bank. Nearby, there appeared to be a flat river bottom area about 50 yards wide. The lieutenant whispered to me to enter the water and gauge its depth. Holding onto bushes at the edge, I lowered myself in and found the water nearly neck-deep, with a strong current that almost swept me away. I quickly climbed out with the lieutenant's assistance. However, he wasn't satisfied until he had tested it himself. I held him as he entered the stream, but he deemed it impossible for us to cross at that point. It was the first chance we had had of getting a drink of water for many long, weary hours, so I took off my large slouch hat, the crown of which would hold about a gallon, filled it from the stream and passed it around. Each man drank until he was satisfied, and we all declared it was the sweetest water we had ever tasted. The night was slipping away, and we cautiously explored the bank of the swift-running stream for a ford. Owing to the fact that the melting snows in the mountains at that season of the year sent all streams in that section almost out of banks, it looked like a hazardous undertaking. In the rear and down the river, we could see and hear great circles of the Indians holding a war dance around burning piles of wood and brush. The flames lighted the spot about them, and the forms of the Indians could be distinctly seen, jumping about and flourishing weapons. I never will forget the weird appearance of those savages, as their yells and whoops echoed up and down the valley plainly. The only musical accompaniment was a sort of ha-ha, ha-ha. We afterward learned that they had the heads of 3 of our comrades, and that these men were partly burned in the fires by these red devils. It looked as if even the squaws were taking part in the exciting dances. From the excitement, it was quite apparent to us that the Indians had had a successful day of it. As we had not heard anything further from our comrades since dark, we thought probably they had taken advantage of the night to retreat still further. One thing we did know: our only hope of safety was in getting on the other side of the river. We continued our march upstream slowly and cautiously, trying in vain to find a fording spot, but were unsuccessful. We then decided to return to the place where the command had crossed early in the afternoon when making the first attack on the village. In this conclusion, we came to a spot where it seemed likely we could cross the stream. I waded in and found the current less swift, the water reaching but a little above my knees. The others followed, and we crossed what we supposed was the main stream, but we afterward discovered we were on an island. The river divided a short distance above and ran on each side of this strip of land, which was of considerable extent, being nearly a mile long and several hundred yards wide. It was dotted with thick clumps of blueberry bushes, some of them covering as much as 20 square yards. There were also some young cottonwood trees on this island, and some tall, rank grass which reached to our waists. We crossed the island diagonally, supposing we were really on the other bank, but suddenly we came to the river again. This confused us very much. In riding to the attack in the afternoon, we had not observed this island, and we wondered if we might not have become turned around and lost our direction. We tried again to cross the main stream, but it was useless, as we saw nothing on the other side but steep bluffs which we could not possibly climb. As we were moving cautiously about, we came to one of these thick clumps of bulberry bushes, and a startled voice suddenly hailed us. The deep, guttural tones were those of an Indian, and Gerard and Jackson wheeled their ponies like lightning and galloped away in the direction from which we had approached. That was the last we saw of them until we met them in camp the following night. Lieutenant DeRudio and I were some 10 yards apart when the challenge came. I saw him kneeling down in the tall grass and followed suit as quickly as possible. Had we run away, there was a clear space of nearly 100 yards which we would have to cross before we could get under cover of one of the brush clumps. The Indians most assuredly would have fired on us. Hearing nothing further after Jackson and Gerard galloped away, the Indians evidently thought something was wrong. as they jumped their horses into the river with the greatest haste and confusion. To accelerate their flight, Lieutenant DeRudio fired 2 shots from his revolver in quick succession. I had my carbine pointed in their direction, and I sent a bullet after them. While I was reloading, the lieutenant sent another shot after them. By this time, they were across the river. I had not seen any of them, only heard the noise and clatter, but the lieutenant, who was nearer the river, said he could see 6 or 7 Indians, who appeared to be on picket on the point at the fork of the river where it divided to form the island. As I was about to fire a second shot, DeRudio called out, "O'Neill, they are all gone." Possibly the Indians were somewhat drowsy after their hard day's fight, and maybe we caught them napping. I think it must have been about 2 o'clock at this time. We retreated backward a few hundred yards. From there we wandered about on the island, unable to understand how we were surrounded by water as well as Indians. After this experience, we were afraid to go up to the ford of the afternoon, for fear of running into more Indian pickets. After walking back and forth along the main part of the stream, in a vain attempt to find a ford, I became so tired and utterly worn out that I exclaimed, "Lieutenant, please let us sit down. My boots are full of water, and my clothing all dripping, and I want to wring them out." So we sat down in a clump of brush, and I took off some of my clothes, my boots and stockings. I had just finished wringing my saturated clothing and began to put them on again, when we were once more startled by the clatter of horses' hoofs and the sound of voices. The morning was dawning on us before we realized it was growing so late. The Indians were coming past in front of us and along the riverbank to begin another attack on Reno's command. The lieutenant had pulled on his boots and I was tugging at mine. He arose and looked out. A column of mounted men were passing us about 200 or 300 yards away. Calling to me in a low tone, he excitedly said, "O'Neill, I believe it is the command." By this time I had my boots on and joined DeRudio. I could see horsemen, but in the uncertain gray of approaching dawn, I could not distinguish who they were. They were riding in great numbers, and were near enough so we could distinguish the sound of voices only. Some of them had ascended the bluff through a cut or washout in the bank, which heretofore we had not observed. The lieutenant observed one man dressed in a buckskin suit, whom he took to be Captain Tom Custer, as he had worn such an outfit on this expedition. DeRudio whispered excitedly, "That surely is Tom Custer." Some of the horsemen were climbing the steep banks on the other side of the river. Some were just at the top and could overlook the island we were on. The rider whom we took to be Tom Custer was just going up the cut. I thought it surely was Captain Custer, and was nearly overjoyed at the prospect of soon being with my comrades once more. At the same time, Lieutenant DeRudio stepped boldly out on the riverbank and shouted, "Hey, Tom Custer! Tom Custer!" The riders stopped and looked in our direction, and then in an instant the war whoop sounded and a volley of at least 50 shots were fired at us. How we escaped being hit is a miracle, for the bullets cut the brush about us in every direction. The riders were all Sioux Indians dressed in some of the uniforms they had taken, we later learned, from Custer's men in the battle the previous afternoon, and were riding 7th Cavalry horses which they had captured. Our escape on this occasion was simply miraculous. None of the Indians made any attempt to cross the river after us. We jumped into the bushes on the opposite side from where we had been standing and, stooping low, ran toward another clump, bending over so that only our backs could be seen above the grass. In this way, we reached another thick clump of brush, and just as we were going around it, we ran plump into another party of mounted Indians. In fact, we were so close that we almost ran over each other. There were 6 or 7 Indians in the party, and our sudden appearance took them by surprise and frightened their ponies to such an extent that the animals all reared and began to plunge about. Evidently, this party was not looking for us in that direction, although some of the savages on the hill were shouting to their companions down below, doubtless warning them to be on the lookout for us. I had my carbine at a ready. The lieutenant had carried his pistol in his hand for hours, and he immediately opened fire. I also commenced shooting at them. The Indian ponies were rearing, snorting, and plunging about to such an extent that their riders had all they could do to stay on the backs of their animals without using their guns. And to this we owed our lives. While they were in this confusion, we poured 8 shots into them. 2 of the riders, I am sure, fell, and I saw 3 ponies gallop away riderless. I think we must have wounded others who managed to cling to their ponies. This was a most one-sided encounter. We had the advantage of being on the ground and could deliver a rapid and effective fire. We stood shoulder to shoulder. I did not even throw my carbine to my shoulder. The Indians were so close, but just pointed it in their direction and pulled the trigger. Though I scarcely expected to remain alive 5 minutes longer, I felt the greatest satisfaction at having inflicted so much injury to the enemy in the short space of time allowed us. I have often wondered if those Indians who did manage to get out of range alive did not consider us two demons whom they ran against in the gray of that June morning, to inflict so much damage among them in such a short space of time. The lieutenant was a quick and accurate revolver shot. He fired 5 shots, and I am sure he hit the mark every time, while I fired 3 shots with my carbine. The Indians only fired a single shot at us, which went wild of the mark. DeRudio then shouted to me to run. The last thing I saw of those Indians, 2 or 3 of them were on the ground, and several ponies were rearing over each other. In our flight, and about 150 yards from the spot of this last encounter, we came to a place of all places on the little island which was an ideal spot to make a defense and have the advantage of covering. Sometime previously, several cottonwood trees had been cut down at this particular point, leaving stumps about 3 feet high. A freshet had later occurred, washing many fallen logs against these stumps, and there they had remained, forming a small angle and making a perfect breastwork from which to fire. Lieutenant DeRudio's quick eye caught the place, and he exclaimed, "Quick, O'Neill, get in." He jumped in among the fallen logs and I after him. We wormed our way still deeper into the mass of debris and found that we were perfectly protected by the logs. Before any Indians could get at us, it would be necessary for them to cross an open space of nearly 100 yards, and besides, would have to climb over our barricade to reach us. We here shook hands with each other, declaring we could not run a step further. If we had to die, as it certainly seemed, we would die there fighting. I took off my cartridge belt and found that I had just 25 rounds left for the carbine and 12 for the pistol. As the lieutenant was the better pistol shot, I gave him mine in addition to his own and the ammunition for them, while I retained the carbine. About the time we landed in this retreat, we heard fierce musketry on the hills, apparently about a mile distant. The Indians had again attacked Reno's command. We could hear our comrades responding beautifully. We could also hear the Indian chiefs calling to their men down in the river bottom. Several shots were fired in our direction, but we laid low and did not respond. All this time we were momentarily expecting the Indians to make a rush on us, and we were looking in every direction for them. The ground behind us sloped down to the river, which was about 200 yards away, and there was a clear space all about us of nearly 100 yards. The grass was tall, and we kept a sharp lookout, lest some of the Indians crawl up on our position. We figured that in the event of a charge, we ought to be able to kill 5 or 6 of them anyway. I do not think they knew exactly where we were, although several of their bullets struck the logs behind which we were lying. Occasionally we could see them by 2s, 3s, and 5s, but not any closer than 250 yards at any time. So we laid low and never fired a shot because we did not care to draw their fire. The lieutenant cautioned me, when they come to the clearing and seem to be looking for us, you take dead aim at the foremost, and then keep up the fire while they are coming toward us, but don't shoot until you are dead sure of your aim. At target practice, I could hit an object the size of my hat nearly every time at 200 yards. I was no longer nervous. I had become so desperate that it seemed to quiet my nerves, and I am sure I was as steady as at any time in my life and could do as good shooting. We scarcely expected to get out of this place alive, but it seemed our duty, so the lieutenant said, to defend ourselves as long as possible and to the best of our ability. There was no use surrendering, as it only meant death by the most horrible form of torture. About this time, a second charge was made against the troops on the hill, and again the Indians were repulsed. Then a desultory firing was kept up by the savages. As we later learned, the Indians picked off a great many men during the intervals between the charges. It was now about 9 o'clock in the morning of the 26th, and we were wondering how long the Indians were going to delay the time when they would come to hunt us out. We conversed in a low tone. The lieutenant said, "O'Neill, I believe they are afraid to come after us. They do not know exactly where we are, and they know they will lose more than they can get. That lesson we taught them a while ago may be our salvation." Then DeRudio added, "O'Neill, are you married?" "No, sir," I replied. "Well," was the response, "I would not care so much if I were alone. But what will my wife and 3 young children do if I get killed? That's what is worrying me." About this time, we heard the sound of voices and the tramp of horses close at hand. Looking cautiously out, we could see great bands of the squaws and children passing on the bottom, up the river, toward the mountains. The squaws were riding like the men, carrying their babies on their backs. Children 6 years of age and upward rode ponies, and all such were mounted. Their cooking utensils and provisions were all packed on travois. Other ponies were being led or were driven along. We were glad we were not lying where they could see us as they passed. The squaws seemed quite merry, as they were singing and cooing, laughing and shouting to each other. I judged that it took them an hour or more to pass. Sometimes there were bunches of them a couple of 100 yards wide. They did not march in any regular order. Finally, it appeared that all had passed us. Although we could not now see an Indian any place, yet we knew they were on the bluffs over us, as an occasional charge was made on the command. Our hopes now began to revive considerably. We trusted that the command would be able to drive them away, not realizing how badly the troops had been crippled and how they had to act on the defensive. 1 hour after another gradually wore away, until it became about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I think it was about that time the Indians made the last charge against the command, and it seemed to be a most desperate one and more fierce than any preceding it, judging by the musketry fire and the whooping and yelling on the part of the Indians and the cheers from the troopers. We later learned that the position held by Reno was on top of the highest bluff, while the ground sloped gradually away, with several washouts or deep cuts running in all directions from it. The troopers were formed in line all around the top of this bluff, and in order to reach them, the Indians were obliged to climb the steep sides. In the last charge, some of the savages managed to gain the top of the bluff before they were killed. The troops countercharged them, and the loss among the Indians was so severe that they made no further attempts to gain the bluff. Had they once broken the line, not a man would have been left to tell the tale. By 5 o'clock, the shooting seemed to have entirely ceased. Neither could we see any further signs of Indians. I finally asked the lieutenant if I might crawl out and take a look around. He told me to do so, and I crawled out to make a little reconnoiter. On the high bank on the other side of the river, I saw one solitary Indian, mounted, seemingly on picket. I now moved to a spot where there was a little more shrubbery growing and very cautiously stood up for a look. On our side of the river, and only about 300 yards from us, I counted 15 Indians sitting in a circle, seemingly smoking and talking among themselves. They were near the bank of the main channel of the river. After a glance about, I stooped down and carefully and slowly crawled back to the lieutenant and reported what I had seen. We now renewed our vigilance, feeling sure that an organized effort would be made to locate us before the Indians left. As we heard no further shooting, nor any signs from the command, we concluded they had retreated and that the main body of Indians had followed them up, leaving a few to guard the spot where we had last been seen. Now it was again getting near sundown and darkness would soon be coming on. Our hope of getting away now began to rise again rapidly. I became so nervous that I could not contain myself, and for the first time during the day began to feel afraid. Everything was deathly silent around us. I often imagined I saw the forms of Indians creeping up on us, and was nearly ready to fire as the dusk of night came on. It was now, as much as at any previous time, that Lieutenant DeRudio showed himself to be one of the coolest and bravest men I ever saw. He repeatedly quieted me by his sound advice and reassuring manner, saying, "O'Neill, I know we will get out of this all right if you will just be patient a little while longer. From our experience last night, I am certain the Indians will not shoot at night if we chance to run into them. We now know how to get across the river, and if we do not find the command, we will follow our trail back to the Yellowstone River, traveling at night and hiding by day. We can pick up some scraps to eat in our old camps, or maybe we can shoot a deer or an antelope. I am sure we can reach the Far West, our supply steamer, in 5 days. But I am in hopes of finding the command on the other side of the river, and then we will be all right." We now wrung out our wet clothes and dried ourselves as much as possible. We were, as we thought, about a mile from Reno's supposed position, and as we did not see any further signs of Indians, we walked along in that direction. Occasionally we would lay down and listen, but could hear nothing. The great valley seemed absolutely deserted. We had thought that if the command still held the place where we supposed it to be, we ought to hear some sign of life, and came to the conclusion at last that the troops must have retreated. Our next decision was to follow the trail down to the Rosebud and thence to the Yellowstone. We knew the general direction. We decided to cross the divide as soon as possible to the Rosebud, and when daylight came to hide in the brush until night, then resume our march until we came to a place of safety. We began our march along a dry creek and continued on a mile or so until we came to quite a high knoll looming up in front of us. We then concluded to climb to the top and see if we could locate any campfires anywhere. When we reached the top, we looked about in every direction, but no fires were to be seen. We were just about to take up our march, very much disheartened, when we heard a mule braying in the direction Reno's command had held. That was the sweetest music I believe I ever listened to. It luckily changed our plans very materially. We figured that the mule surely must belong to the command, so we concluded to search for them, come what might. It was a dangerous undertaking at best. If we were certain it was our men, we could assuredly go up within hailing distance and call to them, but we had not forgotten our thrilling experience of the early morning in hailing strangers and determined to take no such chances. If we crawled up on the command, some picket might see us and shoot us, thinking we were Indians. We walked some distance further in the direction from which the braying of the mule had come, stopping every few yards to listen. At last we came near enough to hear the sound of voices, but could not distinguish whether they were our men or not. Now our predicament was perilous in the extreme. We crawled along on the ground on our stomachs, hitching along a few inches at a time, expecting every moment to be detected and shot at. We still heard the sound of voices. Sometimes we would think they were Indians, while again we thought they sounded familiar. At last we heard someone exclaim in a loud voice, "Bring that horse here." I recognized the voice of Sergeant McVeigh of a troop, whereupon I called out to him, "Mac, don't shoot on us. It is O'Neill and Lieutenant DeRudio." Several voices thereupon shouted, "Come on in," which we did in double-quick time. We were in the hands of our comrades at last. Needless to say, we had much to relate that night before we snatched a little sleep. I hope this first-hand account gives you a new perspective on the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Great Sioux War of 1876. Stay tuned for more videos like this. I hope to bring you more first-hand accounts of different battles, so have a great day, and I'll see you next time.